This is Tom Daly on March the 3rd, and this is the interview with Dick Johannes. And Dick, we're going to start with just you giving us your full name, where you were born, and if you don't mind, how old you are.
Okay, name is Richard Nelson Johannes, and I'm known as Dick to most of my friends. I was born in Fort Worth, Texas, and moved to Oklahoma City when I was about 3. My dad got transferred and was raised in Oklahoma and went to the University of Oklahoma. And what was the other question?
The other one was...
how old am I? I'm 83, and actually tomorrow will be 7 months, to be really specific.
Okay. What brought you to this place?
By accident, it turns out. Friend of my wife was looking for a place like this for her mother, and she asked Sue to go with her to look it over. And at the time, they were building the original apartment buildings, and so all they had was placards to look at. And they got the whole pitch from Deerfield about what it was going to be, and so forth. And then they went back out to the car, and the friend said to my wife, "You know, that sounds like a pretty neat place. Maybe we ought to go back and get applications ourselves." So back they went, and Sue brought this information home and talked to me about it, and I said, "Well, let's go up and get the pitch again so I hear all the benefits, etc." And it was $1,000, and at that time you could get it all back if you never came here. So I said, what do we got to lose? A few $100 perhaps in the way of interest on the money, the $1,000, but that was cheap insurance in my opinion. So we signed up, and we said, well, we'll see you in about 10 to 15 years. And it turned out we came in about 13 years.
Yeah. How long have you been here?
10 years and a couple of months.
Okay. Where else have you lived?
Oh my God.
Just name the places.
We moved 23 times in 38 years when I was in the military, and then after that was in commercial nuclear power generation. So we've lived in Norfolk, Charleston, New London, Seattle, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, New Orleans, San Diego, Lawrence, Kansas, Russellville, Arkansas, Waterford, Connecticut, Washington, D.C. I think that,
A lot of places.
Yeah, Dam Neck, Virginia, briefly, Idaho Falls, Idaho, when I was in nuclear power training, Mare Island Naval Shipyard when I was in the academic part of nuclear power training. Bottom line is lots of places.
A lot of places, okay. Who is the earliest ancestor you know about? And where and when did they live?
Okay. The earliest one I ever met would be my grandfather on my dad's side. The grandfather on my mother's side passed away before I was old enough to remember. But my grandfather and grandmother on my dad's side would be the oldest that I met. But if you go back in the genealogy, it turns out that I'm descended from Germans who were invited by Catherine the Great to move to Russia and farm the land. and they moved to a little settlement on the Volga River near Saratov, what's now modern Saratov, Russia. And they lived there for several generations. And then my grandfather, who I just referred to, in about 1905, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there, decided this is not good, looking good. Catherine the Great had promised him no taxes, no military service, free land to farm. Well, things were going south in Russia, and lots of Germans bailed out and came to the United States.
And the date around that time, Catherine?
Probably around 1906 was when he moved to the States.
But your ancestors, when they moved to Russia, was Catherine?
Probably, yeah, whatever. I don't remember the dates of Catherine the Great.
It's okay.
I think it was late 1700s, but I'm not sure of that.
Okay. Tell me about your parents.
My parents. Dad was one of 11 children, and they were basically, my grandfather was a tenant farmer, and when Dad was in high school, they were in the Kansas City area, and he never talked about it, but reading between the lines, Dad decided this was not for him. And he had a couple of sisters who were living in Kansas City, basically working as, we'd probably call them nannies today. And he left the farm and went to Kansas City to live with one of his sisters. Graduated from high school there, went to work for Piggly Wiggly grocery stores, eventually moved over and started working for Safeway stores, and worked his way up into the middle management ranks of Safeway, and got transferred from Kansas City to Arkansas to Texas, where I was born, to Oklahoma City, and a 1-year stint in Montana. That's a whole nother story. And then back to Oklahoma. And he worked there for 27 years, I think.
And what was he like?
What was he like? Hard worker, religious. He was a member of the Lions Club. He was a member of the Masons in the Shrine. He rose to be potentate of the Shrine, which is in Oklahoma. His employment probably kept him from, when he was very active with the Lions, from being president of the Lions Club. Well respected by his peers. Really just your classic stereotype of a hard-working, dependable, never met a person he didn't like type thing. Certainly somebody to look up to and try to emulate.
Mm-hmm. And your mom? Tell me about her.
My mom was interesting. Mom grew up in Sedalia, Missouri, and somewhere along the line went to a little bit of business school and met my dad, and they got married and moved around. She was a stay-at-home mom, very, very active in the church, kind of one of those solid citizen that you depend on in the church to be the one who's always there for whatever project that needs a volunteer. Particularly was involved in a lot of cooking when there were various dinner functions associated with church activities. What else would I say about her? She was very strong-willed, although she would admit that the one thing she couldn't stay away from was cigarettes, and eventually succumbed to lung cancer. And I can remember her pulling the oxygen out of her nose, turning it off, having a cigarette, and then putting it right back in. And she said, "You just don't understand." And I never did understand, because she was such a, once she decided she was going to do something, she was going to do it. That's all there was to it. And
Pretty stubborn.
yeah, it could be. And well, I would prefer to say it was strong-willed rather than stubborn, because she could be flexible, but very interested and supportive of me growing up, and made sure that I did all the right things and was involved in all the right things, which was interesting along the way.
Did you have, or do you have brothers and sisters?
None. I'm it.
You're it.
Yeah, it took them 10 years to conceive me, and the doctors told her, and this is kind of funny looking at today's world, they told her she should never have any more children. She was too old. And, you know, she was like 29, I think, at the time when I was born. So,
Well, tell me about the building you grew up in, the earliest one you can remember.
well, that would be 2228 Northwest 27th. A 1930s style home, 1 bathroom, 3 bedrooms, living room, dining room, kitchen with a breakfast nook off of it. Brick. Had a front yard and a backyard that were reasonably sized. 2-car unattached garage.
And do you remember other homes that you lived in?
Yeah, we moved when I was in junior high. We moved across the street to 2225, which was a much bigger house. Again, brick construction. Then when Dad went to Montana for 1 year, we were in a small house with no yard, and we had, well, it had a yard, but it was all essentially gravel. So I remember digging out about 3 or 4 inches of that, getting rid of it, bringing in dirt, and establishing a lawn there. Then we moved back to Norman, Oklahoma, and we had a ranch-style brick house there, about 5 blocks from the high school.
Okay. Describe the neighborhood you grew up in, and was there a favorite gathering place?
No, there was no favorite gathering place. The neighborhood had a couple of kids my age in it, and mostly the rest of the neighborhood, I would say, were older people. There was a park about 3 blocks away that I spent some time in, but it was a pretty classic middle-class neighborhood.
schools have you gone to?
What schools? Well, let's see. I started out in Oklahoma City and went to Gatewood Grade School, Taft Junior High School. Then we moved and I went to Butte, Montana Public School, High School for 1 year. Then we moved to Norman and I went to Norman High for 2 years, then graduated and went to the University of Oklahoma for 4 years. Went in the Navy. While I was in the Navy, I got an opportunity to go to graduate school. So I went to the University of Washington for 2 years. I got a master's in public administration with an emphasis on international relations. That's a whole nother story. The Navy wanted me to learn about international relations with the idea that I would someday maybe be an attaché somewhere. That never panned out because the submarine force wouldn't let me get out of the submarine force. They needed guys to go to sea.
Okay. Did you have a favorite teacher growing up? Do you remember one?
Oh, did I have a favorite teacher? I can't say that I had a specific favorite teacher, and I've lost my memory, has failed me. My second grade teacher was very influential. I learned to write cursive in those days. And then I had a Latin teacher in junior high that was very influential. And then when I moved to Montana, I had second year Latin, Ms. Marr, and she was certainly influential. Then when I went to grad school, John Reshitar was the professor that I did most of my classes with. He was an interesting Ukrainian. Interesting nowadays with all the Ukraine war, he was a Ukrainian who had nothing positive to say about the Russians, even back then. And that was in the late 60s.
Okay. How did you and your family celebrate holidays or any special days?
I would say that most of those were oriented to how the Episcopal Church we went to, which was the cathedral in downtown Oklahoma City, how they were particularly celebrating the holidays. Being an only child and not having any close collection of cousins and all, we never really got together as a family. There was a relative on my mother's side, Aunt Sally and Uncle Arthur in Kansas City, that we used to go up and visit in the summer, but that was a little not necessarily oriented to the holidays.
Mm-hmm. Any special memories about family gatherings at all? With those that you just mentioned?
Well, probably the Kansas City relatives were the ones that we were closest to, and like I said, we'd get together up there. They never ventured south. I don't know. He was an architect, and so I guess he felt he had to stay pretty close to his business.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to shift gears a little bit. How long have you been married? And tell me how you met your partner.
Okay. How long I've been married? June 1961, 17th specifically. and we've been married 62 years in June. So,
And
how
you
did we meet? Well, I was in college, and I called a friend of mine in the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority house and said, I've never dated a Kappa Alpha Theta, and I think it's time I do that. How about setting me up with a blind date? And so she did, and the rest is history. Sue and I met, and it clicked.
What was it that clicked? What did you like about her?
Well, what did I like about her? Pretty much everything. She was smart. She was fun to be with. She had a good figure. She liked a lot of the things I liked, but she also had some aspects in her background. She had played the piano with the Tulsa Symphony at one point when she was younger, and so she introduced me to that aspect of culture that I really had kind of a void, because as my mother would say, I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, and my mother couldn't either, and my dad wasn't particularly a singer either. We all make joyful noise to the Lord, but not necessarily on key.
Any children?
We have 3 children, all who have been very successful, in my opinion. I attribute that to my wife, who raised them, and I just came around when I was in the Navy. I just came around every now and then and looked concerned, is the way I put it. Anyway, the oldest is an Episcopal priest and has a parish over in Concord, North Carolina, right above Charlotte. Number 2 works for Deloitte, a international consulting firm, and is on their international board of directors. And the 3rd is our son, Rick. And Rick has been an investment analyst. He went to college as an electrical engineer, got out, went into nuclear submarines like I did. He was in for 5 years and decided this was when we were in the so-called peace era with the Russians. And he said, it's just not the same Navy and that you describe and that I lived with all the years I was growing up. So he got out and got in the investment business after he got an MBA at the University of North Carolina.
So is that 3 boys?
No,
The
2 girls, 1 boy.
Oh, okay. 2 girls.
Yeah, Nancy, Karen, and Rick.
Okay. And grandchildren?
9. Nancy has 4. Karen has 2, and Rick has 3. 7 of them have completed college. 2 are in college. We've been at all the high school graduations and all the college graduations so far. 5 are married, and 2 have serious others, and 2 are still footloose and fancy free.
What were you like growing up? What were your interests? Who were your friends?
Well, growing up as an only child, I was around a lot of adults because my parents would include me in whatever activity we're in. I remember playing a lot of cards with me being the only non-adult at the table. I liked electric trains. Used to cover the floor in my bedroom with an electric train in the fall, especially around the holidays. Growing up I was always interested in doing well in school, and one of the interesting moments in my life was a friend of mine came up to me after I'd been awarded a outstanding student academically at the junior high, and he said that really impacted him. And he said, I am going to go to high school and make good grades. And that just, that was an interesting point. I always considered I was an above average student, and I usually excelled in school. Went to high school, I got a C in phys ed in Butte, Montana, because I couldn't climb a rope very well.
Yeah.
And other than that, I was always a straight A student.
What stories have been passed down in your family? And this can go back several generations or just immediate family. Any stories that have been passed down?
Oh my, a plethora of stories if you get right down to it. Lots of stories about granddad and the 11 kids on the farm and that growing up. Then I'm not sure whether you're looking for stories as I was growing up, or whether you're talking about stories since then.
Well, let's start with it when you were growing up.
Well, okay. When I was growing up, I'm not so sure I think of stories so much as my folks, because I was an only child, I guess, and because they enjoyed traveling. Every 2 weeks in the summer, Dad would get a vacation and we would travel. So we covered a whole lot of territory. I walked across the headwaters of the Mississippi. I was down in Florida another time. Went out west, to see Grand Canyon and that sort of thing. So I remember a lot of car trips here, there, and yon to give me a broader understanding of what the rest of the world, the United States at least, was all about. But as far as stories, well, there were stories about the family mostly that were passed around. But even that, I don't remember tremendous numbers of real stories there, except about the family and how they grew up. Not so much on my mother's side, but on my dad's side.
Mm-hmm. And in your immediate family, are there any stories?
Oh my goodness. Oh yeah. Within the immediate family, there are lots of stories because we were in the Navy. As when the kids were growing up, we were never affluent at all. In fact, when we started, we had a paid-for car and $500, and off we went to sub school. by the time sub school, which lasted 6 months, was over, we had $300 in the bank and a paid for car. Then I went to submarines and started getting submarine pay, which was an extra $100 a month. And we were then at least get our head above water. So we would, this probably one of the favorite kids' stories is when we would travel, typically going from one duty station to the next, we'd be staying in a motel, and so we would use powdered milk to put on the cereal in the morning. And our son particularly remembers that we'd put ice in with the powdered milk to cool it off, and sometimes the ice made it to the cereal, and so he loved to tease us about that. And then we went to Disney World one year and took sandwiches, so we went in, did all the Disney things till about lunchtime, went back out to the car, had sandwiches at the car, then went back in and finished enjoying Disney World. So they would probably say that they always had enough, but they certainly did not have a silver spoon in their mouth. So that would probably be the kind of stories that they would love to tell.
Okay. How did your career or job skills change over the years? And if you want to get into your military experience here at this point, that would be fine.
Okay, well, I was a political science major in college. In those days, they called it government, but nowadays you would say it was political science, with a minor in history. And when I was a junior in college, the Navy came out with, I went on an NROTC scholarship, and the Navy came out with a program that if you had a year of calculus and a semester of physics, you could apply for direct input submarines. So that appealed to me, and I did that, and did not really expect to make it a career. In fact, I told my wife, okay, marry me, dear. 5 years, I got to pay the Navy back, and then I'll get out. We'll go to law school and probably settle down in Oklahoma City, and I'll be a lawyer in Oklahoma City. Well, I got into submarines. I liked it. I liked the camaraderie. I liked the people that you were working with. I liked the challenge of the submarine force and what they were doing at that time. I experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, while I was in submarines. And
Where were you during that?
that was in the Western Pacific. We were actually in Pearl Harbor. I qualified in submarines, which is the equivalent of qualifying as a pilot. So you get to wear the submarine dolphins insignia, which is kind of like the flyer's wings on your chest. And as soon as I qualified in submarines, Admiral Rickover's office, he was the father of nuclear power at the time, and they sent me a message, sent the ship a message, and I flew back to Washington to be interviewed by the Admiral for possible inclusion in the nuclear power program. Now, being a poli-sci major, that didn't really kind of fit. the classic mold for sure. And after the interview, I was put on a study program. And after 3 months, I went back to Rickover's office and took an exam on physics and math, which the 3-month period I was to bone up on it and, refresh my memory of it, so to speak. I passed that, and off 10 days later, I was in nuclear power school. I guess he offered me the challenge, and I took the bait, if you will. So I went through nuclear power school. One of my favorite stories is that when I got to the academic portion, which was 6 months academic and then 6 months hands-on, when I got to the academic portion, the officer in charge interviewed all the new students to get an idea of their background. And he went through this list of about 20 different STEM subjects: math, physics, chemistry, and various engineering. At the end of the 20 subjects, he had asked me had I ever had any of this. I was zipped for 20. And he looked at me and he said, "What the hell kind of major were you?" And I said, "Poli-sci with a minor in history." And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Hey, Admiral Rickover accepted me, and I'm here, and I intend to do well." And I finished in the middle of the class, which I felt was pretty doggone good for a guy who was clearly out of his element. The first day of the math class, we covered all the math I'd ever had. And the next day was welcome to stuff that I'd never heard of. And so I was head down, tail up, studying for the whole 6 months. But like I said, I finished the middle of the class, so I felt pretty good about that, because I was basically in there with nothing but engineers.
And then what happened?
And then I worked my way up through division officer to department head to executive officer to commanding officer of a nuclear submarine for 3.5 years. And then I had a couple of...
You were the commanding officer of a submarine?
Of a nuclear, ballistic missile submarine. 16 missiles with about 10 warheads on each missile.
How many men?
About 150.
Okay. And what was it like being the captain of a submarine?
Well, it was great fun. I mean, a lot of responsibility, obviously, but I had a ball because you had a chance to influence a lot of young men. Two of the guys who worked for me went on and made admiral. And I felt like I influenced them and guided them in many respects to develop their potential and achieve what they later achieved.
As a captain of a submarine, what would you say were your greatest strengths?
One, I cared about the people, and two, I understood deadlines, and that was probably the biggest shock when I got out in the civilian world. Is people in the civilian world don't understand deadlines. In the Navy, if the ship was supposed to get underway at 8 o'clock, it got underway at 8 o'clock. It didn't get underway at 7:55. It didn't get underway at 10 minutes after 8. It didn't get underway at 5 minutes after 8. It got underway at 8 o'clock. And that was kind of an extreme example maybe, but that was just an example of the idea of there was a deadline, you met the deadline, or there was a, some kind of time constraint, and you met that.
That's why I showed up here exactly at 10.
Yeah. What else would I say? I grew over the years as I went through my military career and learned a lot about people and obviously a lot about the technical aspects of the job that you had to have to continue to advance. A lot of people have a conception that the military, they've got their conception from movies and things that poke fun at the military and all. The military is really developed in a you perform or you don't advance, and that's the way it goes. So if you want to get to be, there are a lot of wickets you go through. There was a qualification for command that you had to pass. There was a qualification to be a nuclear engineer, which involved a 7-hour written exam and an oral exam after that, that you had to pass along the way. These were all steps that you had to achieve, and you had to develop your skills and your knowledge. So it was not. It was kind of a really, when you get down to it, it was an up or out type thing, and so I achieved command, and then after the submarine command, I had a couple of other assignments, one in personnel, one as training officer for a submarine squadron, and then I had command of a submarine repair ship, 900 men, 300 women, big responsibility because we carried spare weapons, spare groceries, spare parts. We were a floating mini shipyard. We could replace the propeller underwater. We could weld on the nuclear power plant. And I achieved a lot of success there. We won the battle efficiency 3 years running, which was the best in class, so to speak, award.
Were your parents still alive when you became?
My mother had passed away about a month before I took command of the submarine, and my dad was around for all of the command, both of the commands. He remarried, and he lived a couple of years past the time I had my last command.
Yeah, just think how proud he was of you.
Oh yeah, he busted a lot of buttons. I was the first in the family to go to college. I was the first in the family to be in the military for, as I look back on both sides of the family. So that was, yeah, they were very instrumental in molding me into the driven person that I was, because I was driven to succeed, I guess is the way you'd put it.
Now, in retirement, do you have any hobbies or anything like that?
Oh yeah. Well, I like to play golf, but I also like to volunteer and, if you will, give back. I've been president of the homeowners association actually it was 22 homes back in Kinmure where we lived. And then I also concurrently was president of the whole Kinmure Homeowners Association, 650 residences. Came to Deerfield and was president of the Residents Association here and president of the local Rotary Club. Still very active in the Rotary Club. Do volunteer work as a tax preparer for the AARP program that provides free taxes for all the residents and employees.
Now you've named 2 organizations already. Any others that you belong to or have been active in?
Well, of course, the church. I've been a lay reader, chalice bearer, vestry member, junior warden, all those various tasks at various times. Not only went back when I was in the military, but after I retired. So,
what music do you like, and how has music impacted your life, if any?
very interesting question. I particularly like the music of the 50s, 60s, obviously, because I grew up in that period. And I found that the country music of the 80s, 90s, early 2000s is much the same, has the same beat, tells stories kind of like those songs back in the 50s and 60s did. So I've always enjoyed that. I also enjoy listening to classical music. Not much on hip hop and some of the current music. I think a lot of it's noise, particularly the discordant stuff that I just don't understand why anybody particularly likes that. Never been a big jazz fan. That kind of fits in that discordant thing. It just never has quite turned me on, so to speak. But that'd probably be the music I like.
Do you have a favorite song, or you and Sue have a favorite song?
Well, that's an interesting story they bring up. When one of my grandchildren got married, before the marriage, they gave us a heads up and said, hey, we want to have the traditional, father, daughter, and first dance that all receptions typically have. We also want to have a grandparents dance, and you're the only two grandparents we have. And we went, huh? At our age, you want us to dance? Are you kidding me? So we thought about it, and we finally decided, settled on Elvis Presley's I Can't Stop Loving You. So we arranged this in advance, and we did the Can't Stop Loving You, but we were not about to go out there and dance for 3 or 4 minutes. First of all, because we thought it was boring for everyone else. Second of all, we weren't sure we could dance that long without falling down. Sue's had polio in both legs, and that affects her mobility to some degree, certainly her balance. And I've got a problem with one of my legs, so I've got balance problems also. So what we did is we set it up so that we danced for about a minute, and then the the microphone that the band leader was using was real handy to the dance floor. So I grabbed the microphone and I said, okay, let's step up this party and get it really moving, or words to that effect. And with that, the band leader went right into Proud Mary. And we had prearranged for all of the wedding party, the grooms and their the ladies to all come out on the floor immediately. Well, within 30 seconds, the entire floor was so jammed you couldn't move. It was amazing. And we had not told our daughter and son-in-law about this. So when I grabbed the mic, he turned to his wife and was going, "What the hell's going on?" So that was great fun to pull a little stunt on them. But of course, the bride and groom were in on it from the start.
Yeah. What would you say are the greatest challenges that you've faced in your life?
That's a very interesting question. Okay, the greatest challenges I've faced in my life were succeeding in the military world. First, I had to get through sub school, which again, poli-sci major in a basically engineering-oriented operation. Then I had to pass what's called the engineer's exam that I mentioned earlier, which involved 7-hour tests back at Admiral Rickover's office and interviews about the weaknesses you demonstrated in the test to see if you really had any idea what you were talking about, or you just screwed it up a little bit, or whether you were completely clueless about what was going on. And then qualifying for command, there were wickets there that you had to go through.
So mostly had to do with your career.
Oh yeah,
challenges.
I would say yes, because I was very blessed. As I said, I married a very smart woman who was very thrifty. It would be a polite word to use. So I never had a problem with having enough money. Like I said, we were never affluent, but we certainly always had enough money. And trying to raise the 3 kids and instill in them the proper values is always a challenge. But I've been able to achieve all that. Then the biggest challenge that then came along after I got out of the military was the country went right into a recession about that time. This was 1987. And savings and loans were going broke, and shopping centers were closing their doors, and becoming vacant buildings. And that was just the time I chose to retire. And so getting a job, I thought it'd be a piece of cake. I'd get out of the Navy, I'd go back to Oklahoma. Both our parents, mother and father on both sides, were in what I'll call fragile good health. So we felt an obligation to get back to Oklahoma and be available to help them. And Oklahoma oil was $12 a barrel. Now it's what, $80 a barrel. So there were all sorts of outfits that had gone broke, and I applied for a job, and there'd be 50, 60 applicants, most of whom had some networking connections, and so that was a real challenge finding a job.
Yeah.
And eventually did, but then fate came along, and a contemporary of mine in the military had gotten out 6 years before I did, and he had risen up in the ranks of a commercial nuclear power generation, and he called me up about a year and a half after I retired and said, I need help. And one thing led to another. I ended up working for him, and then he got a couple of promotion opportunities along the way, and drug me along behind him. So I ended up being chief administrative officer at a nuclear power plant in Kansas at one point.
So that really worked out.
It did. It was not at all what I expected, but then if I look back on it, a submarine career was not what I expected when I finished college. A nuclear power generation career was not what I expected after I got out of the Navy. It's just kind of interesting how life twists and bends.
Yeah. So what historic events, like marches or protests or performances, have you experienced? Historic events.
Oh my!
You
Well,
mentioned the
all right.
Cuban crisis.
There was the Cuban Missile Crisis, way back in '63, I guess it was. I was on the first submarine to go into Japan, first nuclear submarine to go in Japan after World War II. So that was kind of a historic event, to say the least. There was a crisis in Lebanon when I was a midshipman. This was while I was in college. Every summer I'd spend 6 weeks on a midshipman cruise. And between my freshman and sophomore year, there was a Lebanon crisis, and the ship I was assigned to almost got deployed over there, but then things cooled down, and so they didn't deploy it after all. Then as my career went on, I didn't really think of any, there was Vietnam, and I was on a submarine that operated off of Vietnam at one point. After the Vietnam crisis, Vietnam War cooled down. We still had a Cold War with the Russians, and I certainly lived through that. And that was still going when I retired. Then it not officially, you can't say officially because that's not accurate, but to the common man, that all terminated when the Berlin Wall went down. However, that didn't really stop that at all. Back in speaking of Vietnam, back in '68 through '70, I was in college at the University of Washington, Seattle. That was a time of a lot of protest and turmoil. I had shipped some books, some professional papers in a box to the NROTC unit at the University of Washington. Well, it got firebombed before I got up there. And so when I picked up the box, it just smelled of smoke like you wouldn't believe. We left it out on the back porch for a couple of days just to air it out, and ended up repacking it completely just to get rid of that smoke. And while I was on campus, we were told never to wear our uniforms because there were just all sorts of protests going on. One of the favorite things that the kids who were protesting did that just drove me crazy was we had open stacks in the library, and they'd go up to the 6th floor of the library and play dominoes by pushing the stacks over. Just nihilistic, stupid, pointless, just anti whatever. One time there was in the political science library at the school, they had the old-fashioned check it out with a little card that you signed up, and they kept the card on file. And a kid came in there with a bottle of India ink and poured it all over those files, just to destroy the files for no purpose.
Okay, what has provided you with the most satisfaction in life? What are you most proud of?
Got to think about that one for a minute. What am I most proud of?
Provided you with the most
I
satisfaction?
guess 2 or 3 things. One, 61 years of happy marriage, 3 kids that have done very, very well, 9 grandkids, all of whom are doing well. So you can say all of that. But beyond that, the ability that I've had, or the opportunities maybe is a better word, to be a positive influence to others. I cited the junior high example. When I was working in one of the commercial nuclear power plants, one of the employees, middle management type guy, came up to me one day and was talking to me about getting a master's degree. And he said, I've got the opportunity to do that. I just don't know whether I want to do it. And I said, education is something that you can never, nobody can ever take it away from you. It's yours, and you will have achieved it, and it will make you a better person and more employable, more useful in the world. And that opportunity he then seized and came back later and said, you were the push that caused me to take that extra step. So the ability to, or the opportunity, it's not ability, it's an opportunity to influence others in a positive direction has always been something that I've treasured and felt particularly proud of.
Okay. I have one last question. Have you experienced or observed prejudice or racism in your life?
Oh, are you kidding me? First of all, I went to school in Oklahoma, and do not remember any non-whites in my junior high or grade school. When I got to high school, I was up in Montana for a year, and there was clearly a lot of Polish kids, a lot of Catholics, and to me it didn't mean anything, but let me tell you, the Catholics definitely felt different and looked at the world differently than the Protestants did. And that was my first experience of really face-to-face, wow, that's different. Then when I went to Norman High, we had 3 black kids in our school. We didn't have any prejudice. They were just part of the school. Well, my wife experienced about the same sort of thing. So she had a roommate, and her roommate was from Houston. And the subject came up one day, and her roommate said, "You don't even understand. You say you've been to school with black kids. No, you haven't. You went with 2 or 3 kids. Hey, they knew their place. They weren't going to get out of line. They weren't going to make any waves." She said, when you go to school with 40, 50% black kids, it's a completely different experience. And so, yeah, I saw that. One of the things I liked about the Navy was that maybe it was there, but I didn't see it in terms of if you could do the job, that's all that was important. You know, it was not whether you were black or white or Asian or Indian or whatever. That was probably, in Oklahoma, if you really go back and think about it, the kids who were significant Indian blood, you didn't have a problem with them in school. But some of the older Indians were often looked down upon in Oklahoma for whatever reasons. I mean, the stereotypes were there, but that was probably where I saw that kind of thing first.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Is there anything else? No, this has been fun.
Okay.
Interesting, caused me to think about some things that I hadn't really thought about before.
Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Hey, enjoyed it.
Good.